Okay. Well, thank you, Toila, for joining us for this interview. I'm going to ask you about 10 questions or so, and it usually takes about 30 to 40 minutes. If you get rolling on something, I'll just let you go, and maybe I'll skip a question if it sounds like you've kind of explored it already. Okay. I might also just ask you to elaborate on something that seems particularly relevant or interesting. And you're, of course, welcome to stop at any time and take a break or ask me a question. So just tell me your name and then what your position is here in the agency.
So my name is Toila McIntyre, and I am an instructor / curriculum writer / researcher / content specialist in the area of child protection.
Okay, thank you. So how long have you taught the course or the training that you're focused on for this EP study?
This is, it'll be 3 years, September 27th.
Great. Can you describe how you came to teach this and then your previous experience?
Sure. So I worked frontline child protection for roughly, with a delegated agency for roughly 8 years. And I went through this training myself, and I found it to be quite useful, and it was a really profound experience for me. So when I went through the training, I actually said to the instructors at the time that one day I would like to teach this, because there's a lot of value in this training. So yeah, I just really believe in what we do here. So I think that's what brought me here.
Okay. So over the years as you've taught it, what are some of the things that seem to keep coming up for you?
Some of the things that keep coming up for me over the years that I've taught it, that things are changing very quickly, that it's crucial. This training is just really crucial. It's really important. Yeah, I don't know. Just things seem to be changing very quickly, I think, is the key thing that stands out for me.
Okay. So how do the current course objectives and the learning outcomes in your eyes fit with or correspond to your own experiences as a practicing social worker?
Well, being that it's mandatory for social workers in this province to become delegated, the objectives, the course objectives really reflect that, right? You have to have this training, you have to build these skills, you have to have this knowledge in order to be able to practice child protection in the province of British Columbia. So, it's a must-have. It's something that's really important to practice, and it's something that I had to do, and I found a lot of value in it. So, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to pause this just because it seems like every time we do this, it's starting
funny?
it's starting to I'm just going to put it on the ground so that the table isn't going to be so key to its success.
Jiggling and moving around?
Yeah, that's all right. It's not just you, of course, it's all of us.
Well, I'm probably fidgeting lots and doing this.
Oh, don't worry about it. Look at me again, if you don't mind. Closer. All right. Can I ask you that question again? Do you mind?
Sure.
So, how do your current course objectives and learning outcomes fit with or correspond to your own experiences as a practicing social worker?
So the current course objectives and learning outcomes are really based on best practice. So it's, like I said, that this training is a requirement. It's mandated by the province of BC in order to practice child protection. So the course objectives really focus on that, on acquiring those skills and the knowledge around best practice and the legislation and policies and practice standards. So I'm just reading the question here so I don't get lost.
Sure.
So how that relates to my own practice in the field, like I said, I had to go through this training myself. And it's really important. There's a lot of value in this training. I learned a lot. By the end of the 8 weeks of this training, I was definitely a better social worker. I had a better understanding of what was expected of me. And it's really foundational, for folks who are coming out of a social work program with their degrees, have very little experience, potentially, right? So having these foundational teachings, this 8 weeks, really provides some really important skills and some really important concepts with respect to best practice and how you're going to practice social work with Indigenous people.
Okay, thank you. Can you tell me how these best practices were arrived at and what input you as an instructor have with them?
Best practices came about years ago when Indigenous communities came together. I can't really say what year exactly it happened, but it was around the time that the AOPSI came out, the Aboriginal Operational Practice Standards. And that was a collaborative effort by many groups, communities around the province who felt it necessary that change needed to happen within the child welfare realm, that the non-Indigenous approach was not working with Indigenous people, so something needed to change, something needed to happen. So that's where the AOPSI came from. So it's a set of practice standards that really speaks to best practice and how to work best with Indigenous people, Indigenous communities. Considering the history, the historical impacts of colonization. So things needed to be done differently. And the AOPSI came together as a result of that. And the society was created as a result of that. So delegated agencies were created as a result of that because things needed to be done differently. So that's how that kind of came about. I believe in that. I feel very passionate about that. And that's very much a part of what I try to relay to the participants in the classroom, because we have both Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants. And it's really important for them to have that foundation before going out there and working with families.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Do you feel that the course objectives and the activities that within them overlap well or fall short of your own expectations, having practiced in the field for the knowledge and competency within the field?
I think at this point they definitely fall short. I think that there are things that we could be doing much better. The curriculum always needs to change, because I had mentioned earlier that there are so many changes always happening within the province, within the ministry. So we're always having to change the curriculum, or we need to change the curriculum to sort of keep up with what's happening out there. So that's always a challenge, and sometimes we don't get a lot of notice when big changes have happened. So we have to sort of, pull ourselves together and incorporate some of those changes into the curriculum. But I feel that we're really falling short on how we're assessing competencies, whether or not competencies are being met. Because at the end of our training, if participants are going all the way through to child protection training, they're completing 8 weeks of training, and in that time frame they do 3 exams. And those 3 exams really reflect whether or not they've memorized the legislation and the practice standards. It doesn't speak to best practice, and whether or not they've acquired the skills to be able to go out there on a human level with people through an Indigenous lens. So that's where I feel that we really fall short. I mean, certainly you hear people sharing in the classroom, and we have many discussions and conversations around how one would go about and what one might do, and we do some role playing and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, we're not really assessing that in our training. So I feel that's where we're really falling short.
Okay. Based on the student feedback, what seems to work really well for them and why? And where do you think, as far as they're concerned, the tensions lie?
From my experience, what I've heard is that they really appreciate the real life stories. This is when they hear the instructors or guest speakers come in and talk about what practice is actually like out there in the field and what you can do and how to act and what to say and how to approach certain situations. They really appreciate that real life experience. They do enjoy role playing. Because again, that's building on that best practice element. Because you have curriculum in front of you and you can read through resources and you can memorize a lot of this stuff, but the actual doing, the hands-on doing and acquiring those best practice skills needs to happen, I think, in a different way.
Can you just give us one example of where you spoke to this already, and maybe just elaborate on the expectations for knowledge and where do you think the objectives of the course fall short, or where the students, what works well for them or doesn't? Just an example that comes to mind.
Well, I think what probably works well for them is, again, having those frank discussions about what works out there in the field and the role playing and learning what to do and what to say when they're out there practicing and really learning how to look through a different lens that they might not be familiar with. So, and of course, the objective of the course is for them to acquire those skills. So,
Okay.
yeah, I think that works well, and that's the feedback we get, is that they really enjoy. Although there's some resistance and hesitation before we do any kind of role playing or simulation. Most people don't really enjoy doing role plays, but after the fact, they express an appreciation for having gone through that, because they actually get to do and say and be a social worker, right? It's not just about reading through some resources in front of them and answering questions, and right. And again, the discussions as well. The discussions are really helpful, and they appreciate that life experience knowledge.
Okay. So based on your understanding of the students who come through the program and the course cycle that you've taught it, and your own experience in the field, how do you interpret the students' accounts of the coherence of the program and the tension of it? And I'll ask the follow-up with that. Do you share that same understanding? Do you have a different lens on what they seem to interpret, or do you feel that what they're telling you is it kind of resonates with you as well?
So I find this to be a challenge, because you could have somebody go through the entire course, and without being able to accurately assess where they're at and how much they're absorbing, it's really hard to interpret that, right? So I think if there is any interpretation, it's through discussion, it's through observation. Other than that, there's really no other way of being able to interpret where a participant is at. Unless they say something really, outrageous, then you can sort of get a sense that maybe they're not quite on board or seeing things the way they should, by that point. But does that answer the question?
Sure. No, that's fine. The question is really to kind of, as far as I'm concerned, it tries to explore whether what the students are telling you, and some of it depends on stage of life and where they're at in their professions, whether their accounts of things are similar to what you also see happening, or do you share a different location in that as the instructor?
I do share a different location, because I have worked in the field for so long, and they're brand new in the field,
Yeah.
right? These are brand new social workers who are just entering the field of child welfare. So by the end of the training, we tend to be more on the same page, but in the beginning, definitely we see things very differently. And that's one of the big pieces of the training, is that we offer, a big part of what we do is is really encourage critical thinking around worldview, and what you may think or what you might see or the knowledge that you have acquired to this point is not going to necessarily prepare you totally for what you're about to walk into. So we offer sort of a next step and the opportunity to think differently through a different lens. And it really requires a lot of critical thinking for a lot of our participants, especially those who have never worked with Indigenous people who are not Indigenous themselves. So yeah, we're definitely in a different place in the beginning, and towards the end we seem to be more, more on the same page.
Do you find, just another follow-up, that as you've taught this training over the years, do you question your lens on them as time goes on, and what does that look like?
I do, particularly with some folks I see come through the program, and I really question whether or not they would be suitable to do this work for many different reasons. Really, what I really pay attention to and what I really look for is whether or not they have the ability to suspend their own frame of reference and suspend their own value system and judgments to be able to go in and work with people without without imposing their own value systems and that kind of thing. So that's a really big part of what I look for. So if it's not there, I do question. I question sometimes people's motivation, right? Authenticity, whether or not they're ready to make a commitment to doing this work, because I think working with Indigenous people and Indigenous communities really becomes a commitment to participate actively in decolonization. So sometimes I don't see that in people, so I do question.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to the second section, which is around evidence of learning. You've mentioned critical thinking is something that you try to engage the students with. It's always a primary goal of teaching and learning. How do you understand, you've just spoken to this, but maybe you might want to say a few more words. How do you understand or frame notions of critical thinking in relation to the themes covered within this course?
I think that critical thinking is essential. I think it's an essential skill in the field of social work. So I think, and especially because much of what we talk about and discuss is often new knowledge for people who might believe and think very strongly about certain things and are very rigid. So it's really important for them to be able to think critically and think differently as a child protection social worker. And really, again, going back to the whole notion of decolonizing. It's really about decolonizing the field of social work is what we, sort of the approach that we take here. So I think critical thinking is absolutely necessary. I think it's a huge part of what we do. It's essential, and it's a big part of social work.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on what you consider to be decolonizing the field of social work?
So historically, the field of social work has, there are many different approaches that people can take to social work, but when I think about, in particular, the area of child welfare and the implications that how things have happened historically, for example, the 60s scoop, and the number of Aboriginal children that were brought into care, and the number of children who were adopted into non-Indigenous homes, and the loss of culture, all the really tragic impacts of colonization. I just totally lost my train of thought. Where was I going with
I was
this?
asking you what do you think of, what do you think decolonization of
Right.
social work
So,
means? Yeah.
So,
okay, I'll edit that out.
thank you.
I'll
So what-
transition to what you say next.
So when we think about, historically, how child welfare has been, has rolled out in this, across the country really, but more specifically in British Columbia, the practice has been, it's just another form of colonization. And it continues to be so until we have complete, complete independence, and until Indigenous people have full power and control over their own people and their own everything, then we're going to continue sort of with this whole colonization practice. But part of what we try to do here, although we are still attached to the ministry, to the province, and we are accountable to them. We still try to approach child welfare through an Indigenous lens, which is part of the decolonization process, so that we're doing things differently and we're not repeating patterns. So although MCFD is still a colonial body, we can do things differently. So it's kind of an interim measure until we have total independence.
Okay, thank you. As the course instructor, what does kind of mastery of the material look like to you? And you can choose a different term if that one doesn't suit you. Does it look like a person, an attitude, a way of being, a demonstration?
All of the above.
Okay.
To me, mastery of course material really, at the end of the day, is whether or not you can go out there and work respectfully and build relationships and trust. Again, considering best practice. So, and how that, I mean, if I think about some of the participants that have gone through the training from start to finish, I've seen a change in attitude. I've seen a change in how people live their lives. I've seen people change, physically, things change about themselves. How they demonstrate that, really the only way that we see any kind of demonstration of whether or not they possess the skills that we've hopefully, the tools that we've hopefully given them, is at the end of the 8 weeks of training, they do a simulation where they do an investigative interview with actors. So that's where we get to see a demonstration of sort of what the tools that they've acquired. But nothing along the way. That's kind of the final deal, and then they go out into their, go back to their agencies, and more assessment happens there, but not, we no longer have any involvement. That assessment is then done by their supervisors in the field.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Can you give some examples of how you try to expose students to good habits of mind or expectations of what it means to be competent or have mastery? Wow,
give some examples of how we do that. I think, again, talking about successful stories in the field. This is what works. This is what worked for me. These are some of the tools that we use. For example, we speak throughout the entire training about a holistic approach to practice, and all-encompassing. We're talking about the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and emotional parts of people, right? So we're looking at things on many different levels, many different layers. So I think when the real life experience and how you can do things in a successful way through an Indigenous lens, from a holistic perspective, is really that's what we really try to impress, and I think that seems to be helpful.
Okay. I'm going to come back to question 3 because
Sure.
you started on question 4 here by talking about holistic learning. What do you think of this term, holistic learning? When you think of it, what images or metaphors come to your mind?
I think of the medicine wheel. I think of the medicine wheel and a lot of the activities that that I introduce in the classroom, and it's actually even used as a tool for self-care. It can be used as an assessment tool. It really reflects, and I think I started to get into this and I started to get lost again. But when I think about the medicine wheel and I think about people, human beings, for example, there are 4 parts to a person: the mental, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual. So when I think of holistic practice, and you can make that bigger, right? You can, the medicine wheel, there are so many different ways to interpret the medicine wheel, but that's a very simple way that I like to talk about, that we introduce to people, and really to consider that there are more than, there are many layers, many parts to a person. There are several quadrants, or 4 quadrants, obviously, quadrants 4, but so when I think of a holistic approach, I think of the medicine wheel, because we're working with people. So I think of a person in that sense, and that person is comprised of those four elements. And when we're working with people, and we're trying to reestablish balance in somebody's life, because again, that's something that comes from the medicine wheel is balance, achieving balance and maintaining balance. And again, that's also an indigenous, it's an indigenous way of being.
Okay, thank you. In relation to this course, how do you engage with students, or have them engage each other, to think on how evidence of learning, their own and then yours, having to assess them, relates to a holistic sense of mastery? Or do you?
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
Which question is it?
It's follow-up to 4. So in relation to this course, how do you engage with students to have them think on how evidence of learning, which is when I look and say, I can see this student's learned, what's the evidence? Okay. How does this relate to a holistic sense of learning?
I think when they, again, it's always through conversation, because they're not writing notes, they're not writing papers, they're not, there's not a whole lot of evidence that's being accumulated through the training. So it's really through conversation, and whether or not they can, when we start speaking about, some of the tools that we're using, some of the situations that we might be in when we go out into the field, some of the issues that we might be facing. So when we have these conversations, if they're able to articulate that they're considering all things in a holistic way. For example, we use a lot of tools in child protection, or in the field of child welfare. So we have assessment tools and tools that we use to get to know a family, just basic strengths and needs assessment is a good example. So that can be used at every level of delegation. And it's an assessment to figure out what's happening within a family, where the imbalances lie, right? So even though the tool itself is very prescriptive, it's very, it's not shaped in a medicine wheel, it's not split in 4 visually, it's, questions and answers, right? But if they're able to look at this tool and articulate how they would incorporate that holistic framework when doing that interview with a family, can they sort of lay the medicine wheel on top of that tool and be able to answer the questions considering all of the quadrants within that person or within that family? So if they can articulate how they would do that, how they can how you would not just consider one really small issue that's going on with the family, but really considering an eco map is another important tool that I talk about in the training, and how, it's more than just a person. There's a family, there's a community, there's society as a whole that's going to impact them. So when they can start articulating that and talking about that, and again, I think that sort of evolves from critical thinking, because historically I think it's been very, we see a person and it's all about the person and not necessarily their environment or their circumstances. History hasn't played a role. So now they're thinking about, how they've been impacted by other people, how their environment has impacted them, how colonization has impacted them. So really being able to articulate that it's not just about that one issue. It's not just about that person potentially using too much alcohol and they have an addiction and they need to go to treatment. So if they can articulate that there's so much more to the picture, it's a much bigger picture, then I get a sense that, they're actually picking up on this holistic approach.
Okay, thank you. In what manner in the training do you frame these opportunities or allow for opportunities for students to really articulate this learning? How do they do that? What activities or structures?
Just discussions. Like quite often, if I find the curriculum to be a little bit outdated or not engaging, just to be creative, I'll just throw something out there, and because it's an experiential learning environment, right? So having those conversations, because we have people of all ages, people of all ethnic backgrounds, we have people with all different kinds of experience. So a lot of those conversations, you really get to hear where people are at and where they're coming from and how they think and what they feel, and so that's really conversation in the classroom is where a lot of the learning happens, and that's where we as instructors get to sort of assess.
Okay, thank you.
What are you pointing? What circle? Oh, sharing circle. So, yeah, sharing circle would be another. It's a big part of our training, and it's something that we do. We used to do it every day, but we only do it twice a week now, and I think that's where a lot of the concepts of I don't want to say it's not a time for critical thinking. It's more of a time for learning how to behave, learning what protocols are, learning how to think differently. So maybe it is critical thinking. But I think a lot of teachings happen in the circle. What else did you want me to say, Kirsten? I know you were.
Sorry, I'm trying to keep myself.
It's okay. We can edit this out.
Bring it back to when I think the original question he asked you was about the holistic learning, what images and metaphors come to mind.
Right.
So
The circle in general, right? Because there are so many.
Sure. Just, start over with that and just say something to the effect, a lead in. I want to talk about the sharing circle.
Okay.
This helps with the video edits.
Okay. So I'd like to talk about the sharing circle and the importance of the sharing circle with respect to holistic practice, coming from a holistic perspective. And being that it's actually one of the very first things that participants are introduced to. And the circle is very important in many respects. A lot of the different tools that we talk about the circle of courage, we talk about the medicine wheel, we talk about the sharing circle. And so all of those things are circular, which is a very important symbol with Indigenous people in this country, because it represents the cycle of life. It represents, full circle. So that's a concept that we introduce immediately, and I think that also represents looking at things from a holistic perspective, all-encompassing.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on now and just ask you a few questions about electronic portfolios, and this is really more of a kind of a sense of where your frame of reference is to it. What do you understand about it? How do you think of it? So why do you want to use an electronic portfolio?
Well, when I was first introduced to the concept of an e-portfolio, I was very excited about it because, and I've mentioned this several times, that we don't assess whether or not competencies are being met throughout the training. And I feel that that's so critical when we're training people who are going out to work with Indigenous people who are dealing with such sensitive issues, that could potentially create so much damage. I think it's critical that we be able to assess whether or not somebody is learning what they need to learn to be able to do the best possible work out there. So at this, like I said, at this point, all we're doing is giving them an exam after 5 weeks, after 6 weeks, and then after 8 weeks. And that really is a memorization of the English language. It's memorizing sections of the legislation, which to me doesn't make any sense, because when you're out there in the field, you can carry that stuff around with you. It's what's in here and the skills that you've acquired around best practice and how to behave and how to speak to people and how to build relationships. So when I think about, sorry, when I think about, how we're not assessing those particular skills, it's a little bit frightening. So I think that having an e-portfolio where participants can they can demonstrate how they're meeting competencies, they can demonstrate how they're learning, they can demonstrate that they're actually acquiring these skills, I think would be a huge asset to communities as a whole.
Okay, thank you. So a professional electronic portfolio process is primarily about creating and linking what we call digital evidence of learning, and these in folios, Mahara, it's called artifacts.
Right.
So linking these to course outcomes or identified competencies. In the context of this course, what about this process appeals to you?
All of it.
You've just spoken to some of it, but feel
All of
free.
it, because it doesn't exist. We have nothing that assesses those critical skills that people need to go out there. We're talking about, potential loss of life. Like, it's that, social work, child protection, social work is that serious an issue, right? And if we're not out there doing, if we're not using those skills and we're not practicing in the best way, then we could be potentially creating a lot of damage in communities. So to me, being able to assess those skills and having people, the participants demonstrate that they're actually getting this, they're learning the tools, they're prepared, they're getting prepared for the work that they need to do. And I just think it's so, so very important.
Okay, thank you. What types of support do you think the students will need to really engage in this process?
I think technical support. Other than that, I just think it's such a fabulous idea and a fabulous concept. I don't know what other support would be necessary. Certainly they would need to, when I learned about ePortfolio and what it was about and what it represents and the importance of it, in particular in this training, I don't know why anyone would even need support. It just makes sense. It makes sense that you do this and you have to prove and show that you've learned something here, right? So technical support, really. Other than that, I don't know. I guess I'll be able to answer that differently once I get in there. Being a social worker myself, I might need a whole lot of support. So yeah, I guess that's something that will be interesting to talk about in a couple of months.
Oh, I will definitely come back with that question again. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's the bulk of the interview. I want to ask you one more question, and I've taken this one and built some learning materials around it. I'm just going to ask you, what do you think, what is an artifact? What do you consider to be an artifact that has learning value?
I think an artifact could be many different things. I think it could be an audio clip, it could be a video clip, it could be a presentation, it could be a written document, it could be any proof of learning. So and it's some way that you can demonstrate that you have met a competency is what I'm thinking. Like, however you can show that. You need to stand on your head and do a dance to show that you've done it, then that's an artifact. So any form of something that you can show that you've learned something. So an artifact could be anything really.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.